Hello class, welcome to week 2 of strategic planning and healthcare organizations. We're going to be looking at chapter 2 in our textbook today. And if you will turn to, I believe it's page 33 in your text, the title of this chapter is Understanding and Analyzing the General Environment and the Healthcare Environment. And your authors have devised 9 learning objectives that they want you to be aware of relative to this chapter. And of course, as we were talking about last week in trying to define what strategic planning is and getting a handle on why we do strategic planning and who all is involved, the next logical approach to that is understanding that before you can actually do any strategic planning for your organization, you have to assess what your current environment looks like externally and internally, so you can come up with some ideas about what you need to take a look at to either fix or leave alone. So the first learning objective is they want you to be able to appreciate the significance of the external environment's impact on healthcare organizations. Number 2, understand and discuss the specific goals of environmental analysis. And by the way, these learning objectives are listed for you on page 35 of your textbook. They want you to be able to point out some limitations of environmental analysis. 4, describe the various types of organizations in the general and healthcare environments and how they create issues that are of importance to other organizations. Number 5, identify major general and industry environmental trends affecting healthcare organizations. Number 6, be able to identify key sources of environmental information. 7, discuss important techniques used in analyzing the general and healthcare environments. 8, conduct an analysis of the general and industry and external environments for a healthcare organization. And last, number 9, be able to suggest several questions to initiate strategic thinking concerning the general and industry environments as a part of managing the strategic momentum of your organization. So, we're talking about external analysis. There's a famous businessman that maybe you have heard of and actually learned about in some of your studies if you've done any business study, a man by the name of Peter Drucker, who said that the most important task of an organization's leader is to anticipate a crisis. Perhaps not to avert it, but to anticipate it. One has to make the organization capable of anticipating the storm, weathering it, and in fact being ahead of it. And this kind of reminds me about the hurricane that we had last summer. We had those of us that live in Florida, and those of you who have lived here previously and have since relocated, understand that when you're dealing with an environment such as what we have here in a subtropic or tropical climate like you've got in southwest Florida or southeast Florida, you always have to be worried about tropical storms, and the most powerful, of course, is a hurricane. So you have to always anticipate that a potential crisis is on the horizon. And during the 6-month period of June through November, here in Florida, we've always got to be aware that anticipating a crisis from that type of a storm is something we always have to keep first and foremost in our mind. There's no way that we can avert it, but we can anticipate it, and that's what Peter Drucker's study is talking about. And by anticipating that it might happen, we will be able to better weather the storm and in fact be ahead of it by planning accordingly. And that's what, of course, storm planners do when they're getting all their information ready for us to understand and decide what we're going to do, whether that is staying in our homes here in southeast Florida and weathering out the storm by staying in your home or leaving the state altogether. Now, the authors go on to do a revisit to strategic planning process, and perhaps you've heard this before in some of your other classes. The strategic planning process consists of doing a situation analysis, then developing a strategy or strategy formulation, and then once you've got that on paper, you can plan the implementation of the strategies that you've designed to help you to fix any of the problems that you've identified within your organization that you want to take forward. And relative to situational analysis, there are going to be 3 distinct things that will help you to determine the strategy of an organization. And those are going to be your external environment, your internal environment, on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're going to be driven down the middle by directional strategies or your leadership, which are going to help you to decide what to do. The external environment is going to tell us that we should do something. The internal environment is going to tell us what we can do. And the directional strategy of our leadership is going to tell us what we want to do. And then we combine all three of those things to come up with a strategy for the organization. So again, we're going to look at external analysis, internal analysis, and directional strategies to figure out where it is that we want to go. Now, to analyze do an environmental analysis, this is we have to be aware of several things that we want to do. We have several questions we want to ask ourselves in trying to discover what this information is. One, does the external environment influence capital allocation and decision-making processes? In other words, is it going to cost us any money? And if it does cost us any money, how is that going to impact our decision-making processes, either positive, negatively, or maybe somewhere in between where we don't have to really worry about it because it's going to have a negligible effect on the organization. We also want to ask ourselves, have previous strategic plans that the organization has done before our coming on board been scrapped because of unexpected changes in the environment? That's a very important thing to understand and to try to determine ahead of time, because you don't want to make the same mistakes as you're entering into this environmental analysis process. Then you're going to ask yourself, has there been an unpleasant surprise in the external environment that came to be? And along with that is competition growing in our industry. We also want to ask ourselves, is the organization or industry that we belong to becoming more marketing oriented? Do more and different kinds of external forces seem to be influencing decisions, and does there seem to be more interplay between them? And is management unhappy with past forecasting and planning efforts? Those are all important things that we want to be aware of as we are entering into this process of trying to ask each other questions and establish on paper what our game plan is going to be for the future. But after we start thinking about these things and we start discussing them amongst ourselves in a planning group, and we decide that we've got a lot of this information, the goal of this environmental analysis should be to do things like identify and analyze the current issues that exist. We want to be able to detect and analyze possible emerging issues. We want to be able to speculate on future issues that may arise. We want to classify and order issues as they become known to us. We also want to identify organizational critical success factors. In other words, we need to know exactly what we have to do as an organization that are critical to our success, and make sure that we don't miss those and put them aside that will cause us problems. We also have to provide organized information for planning, and we also want to be able to foster further strategic thinking as part of this process. Now, even though we've talked about the importance of doing all these things, we also need to be aware of that there are limitations to conducting an environmental analysis. Things that you need to be aware of is that an environmental analysis cannot foretell the future, even though that's exactly what we're trying to do. It's not a crystal ball. And it does not detect everything that's a possibility that may crop up and become a problem or be a benefit. Sometimes information is impossible to obtain, so therefore you're going to be lacking in information. There may be delays in interpretation of some of the information that you receive as part of this environmental analysis. We may get information and not have any understanding of what it means and the implications it's going to have for our organization. We may have the inability to respond quickly simply because we don't have the capital resources or the people or any other things available that can help us to respond to what it is that we've discovered. And last but not least, detection of issues blocked by strong beliefs are things that are always going to crop up. Even though we discover that there are things that may be problematic in doing an environmental analysis of our organization, there may be issues or people or things externally or internally in the organization that are going to be blocked because people have strong beliefs that perhaps these are things that we can't move forward for one reason or another. So, as you go through Chapter 2, take a look at what the requirements are for an external environment. This is where we're going to look at the general environment and the healthcare environment and the service area, the people that we're going to take taken care of. We have to understand how they all impact each other and how they are going to impact the organization. Now, the general environment, things that are outside of our organization are going to be things like government institutions, business organizations, educational institutions, religious institutions, research organizations or foundations, or individual consumers. And as we compare that general environment to the healthcare environment that we have to work within, we need to look at things that are going to have an impact on each other, such as planning and regulatory organizations that can thrust regulatory requirements on us that we have no control over. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that our primary care providers and our secondary care providers, or our provider representatives and our individual patients as part of the healthcare environment, are definitely going to have an impact on the external environment of the organization and whether or not we're going to be successful. And all of these things, the general environment and the healthcare environment, are going to have an impact on what we refer to as our service area. We're going to become more aware of who our competitors are. We're going to be aware of governmental services that may be available out there to the general public. We're going to become more aware of business organizations that exist that are interested in what we're doing as far as the healthcare organization goes. We will also have brought to our attention the existence of not-for-profit organizations that perhaps work in the public health sector. Other local organizations that are not healthcare related but may have an impact on our organization because some of their employees or people that work for them perhaps access our healthcare system. And then, of course, we've also got to be aware of demographics and psychographics of the general population that we're serving. All of these things impacting our organization. So that's all part of the external environment. And that's what you're going to be looking at this week in Chapter 2. So in order to develop a thorough analysis of the environment that we're working in, where you want to scan, monitor, forecast, and assess everything that we've been talking about. When we scan things, we're going to look for or view external environmental information. We're going to organize information into desired categories to be able to scan it, and we're going to identify issues within each category that are going to be helpful to look at. And as we do that, we then begin to be able to monitor that type of information in the environmental analysis, where we can specify the sources of data that we want to take a look at. We can add to the environmental database that we're building up, which will be helpful to analyze. That will help us to confirm or disprove issues that we think are a problem or discover that they're not a problem. And it will help us to determine the rate of change within issues that we're looking at as far as this environmental analysis is concerned. And last but not least, I'm going to take that back. The third step of this process, forecasting, is where we're going to be able to take this information that we've scanned and monitored, and we're going to be able to extend the trends, developments, dilemmas, or occurrence of an event. We'll be able to identify the interrelationships between issues and between environmental categories, and we should be able to develop alternative projections. And then, last but not least, in the assessment process, after we have done all of this, and we've put things in place that we believe are an appropriate and legitimate description of our environmental analysis, we will then be able to evaluate the significance of the extended forecasted issues that we've developed, and we'll be able to identify the forces that must be considered in the formulation of our vision, our mission, our internal analysis, and our strategic plan as it gets developed. So, don't forget to read a little bit more about what scanning involves, and what it is that we're going to be looking at in the environment that we need to be aware of. Same thing relative to our information sources. Remember that we're looking not only at people, but we can look at publications that exist also to get information that's helpful. Remember that our objective as we monitor our external environment is to be able to accumulate a database around an identified issue. That will help us to investigate sources of information, identify organizations creating change, and identify the sources that are reporting changes to us that may have an impact on us as well. Forecasting within an environmental change our objective should be to answer the following question. If these trends continue, remember when you're forecasting, we're talking about forecasting trends and trying to determine where we're going in the future. We want to ask ourselves, if these trends continue or if issues accelerate beyond their present rate, or if this event occurs, what will the issues and trends look like in the future? We want to be looking a year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and that's part of the strategic planning process, to do short-term planning versus long-term planning. Short-term planning is typically described by most people as something that's a year or less. Long-term planning is something that can be multi-year in scope, being 3 or 5 years, and extremely long-term planning is a 10-year window. We also want to be able to identify a full range of possibilities that may exist when attempting to forecast changes in the future. So as we continue to assess our environmental change, remember that our main objective is to interpret the data based on our perceptions, our values, our past experiences, and the context in which we have looked at all this information. This process is largely non-quantifiable and judgmental in scope, so you have to look at a lot of this stuff with a tainted eye and ask serious questions about whether or not the data that you're looking at is legitimate and is it actually going to help us to in the assessment process before we start laying our plans down on paper and move forward with anything that we've identified that we want to do. So remember, we're talking about a strategic planning process, analyzing the external environment to find out things that may be happening outside of our organization as well as inside the organization that are going to help us to develop a strategic plan that will prepare us adequately for the future. Now, in Chapter 2, your authors have devised several figures and exhibits for you. There's some good ones there that talk about assessing issues. There's another one that's called Environmental Analysis Tools and Techniques. There's another one that is called, well actually those are just two different examples that they've got because the Environmental Analysis Tools and Techniques actually consists of 4 different slides that are exhibits. So make sure you take a look at those. The first set of information will be assessing issues, and there's an exhibit there that shows you how to develop a process whereby you can categorize things that you're looking at that are high impact, low probability versus low impact and high probability. So take a look at that and read about the explanation as to how you can use that type of an approach to assess issues that you're looking at. And then last but not least, in the Environmental Analysis Tools and Techniques, look where the authors have listed for you what a technique is, what the primary focus of that technique might be, the advantages of using that approach and disadvantages to using that approach. And that way you'll be able to sort out things that may be legitimate and useful for you as you go through this external analysis of what's happening within your organization. So again, the topic is analyzing the environment. So let's talk about some strategic thinking questions that will help us to validate our strategic assumptions. In other words, if we're going to make assumptions about how to do things, put it down on paper that will become part of our strategic plan, we need to have some really good questions in mind that we're going to actually be able to get answers to. So they should be things like, has the organization's performance been adversely affected by unexpected or new trends or issues in the general environment? Has the organization's performance been adversely affected by unexpected or new trends or issues in the healthcare environment? So same question, but general environment versus healthcare environment. Have new opportunities emerged as a result of new trends, issues, or events in the external environment? Is the strategy acceptable to the major stakeholders that we deal with? Are there new technological developments that will affect the organization? Have there been social or demographic changes that affect the market or strategy? In other words, changes in ethnic mix, language barriers, family structures. Have any of those demographic changes taken place that are going to have an impact on our organization? Has legislature or the political environment changed to any degree? Is there any new local, state, or federal regulations or laws that are being introduced, debated, or passed that will affect operations or our performance? Are there any new economic issues that we need to be aware of that, again, will have an effect on our operations and performance? Have new competitors outside of the industry considered entering or actually entering into healthcare-related areas, which would have an impact on us directly? Is the strategy subject to governmental responses? That's the strategy that we're developing and putting on paper. It is our strategy in conformance with society's moral and ethical codes of conduct. That's something we always have to be cognizant of and making sure that what we're doing is going to be agreeable to everybody. Last but not least, in Chapter 2, they will be able to provide you with terms that you need to take a look at and be able to find a definition for and understand it, beginning with what does assessment mean, all the way to strategic issues and everything in between that's alphabetized for you to take a look at. Again, there's an exhibit or a figure there that the authors have developed for you called conclusions that will have all of these terms listed there for you. So as you go through the chapter, you should be looking up each one of these terms to make sure you have a good understanding of it. So with that, that is Chapter 2. I hope that you find this information getting more interesting as you go, because after all, strategic planning as a healthcare administrator of the future is going to be a very important thing for you to be able to understand and take for action. Again, backing up and understanding from last week as we entered the course, what are the definitions of strategic planning and everything that goes with it. Make sure that you've got a good understanding of what those are. And then as you move into Chapter 2, make sure that you gain a good understanding and what analyzing the environment is all about. And if you are successful in doing that by the end of this week, as we move into Chapter 3, we'll then begin to open up some new information that gets a little bit more broad and generic in scope, where we're talking about service area competitors and conducting an internal environmental analysis and gaining a competitive advantage. So we're going to be expanding these topics to look at how we can be more successful in the future. I'm in the process of starting today looking at your Week 1 work relative to your discussions and your assignments that you submitted to date. So I don't have any input for that yet. But everybody is participating and doing it very well to date. I've been watching the discussion board, and everybody's really getting into it, having good discussions between each other. And that's what this is all about, is to help each other better understand the information. So thanks again for your participation, and I will see you again if I don't hear from any of you during this week as you study new information in Week 2. I'll see you with my next video for Week 3 in about a week. Have a good week and good luck.